Good evening, welcome here. Good to see you all. And my name is Christian. If you guys don't remember, last thing I taught was what is the Bible. So today I am with poetry. So right off the bat, I am not a poet. I'm not somebody that reads poetry for fun or regularly. So this was challenging for me to prepare this. And it was challenging in a very good way. And I hope I can pass on some of the things that I have learned and I've grown to appreciate about poetry. I hope I can pass that on to you guys tonight as well. So let me start with a prayer, and then we'll dive into our first exercise. Dear Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for all the people that came out. Thank you for the space and this freedom to just sit down and to just look at your word, the Bible, just a little bit closer, to look at the things you've inspired people to write down, and in a specific way to learn about poetry today. And so, Jesus, we want to invite your Spirit into our midst, that he would guide our conversations, guide our hearts and our thoughts towards truth, towards you, that we would learn to understand you better. And just that you would guide our conversations tonight, and that it would lead to growth and to, like I said, getting to know you better. Amen. So, I thought to start things off tonight, it would be fun to look at, first of all, what is poetry. So you have one handout there that is Exodus 15 and 16. It's the one with a lot of words. And so for the first 10 to 15 minutes, I want you to spend some time reading that one. Don't worry about the psalm. We'll dive into Psalm, is it 29 or 27?
29.
We'll dive into Psalm 29 later on tonight. So right now we're just looking at Exodus 14 and 15. And I took away some of the formatting so that it's not quite as obvious which part is poetic and which part is narrative. And so I want you guys to spend some time reading it and discerning what is a story and what is a poem. And then as you're distinguishing between the two, just write down some of the things that makes you think this is a poem, right? Like just some of the characteristics, some of the clues that you pick up. Okay, this sounds like a poem, and it sounds like a poem because of this. So, does that make sense? Go for it.
As tables or individuals?
You can do it as a table. I'm always weary if some of you want to prefer to do it by yourself. Go for it as well. Like, it's not rude to distance yourself and just be in your own thoughts. But if you don't mind, do it as a group in your tables. The groups aren't that big. 2 and 3 should be fine. Maybe to start off, we'll do 2 to 3 minutes quiet so everybody has time to read it through themselves, have some own thoughts, and then start discussing. We'll focus back together, and how about we share some of the thoughts we had. First of all, anybody care to reveal to us which part is narrative, which part is poetry of the text? Anybody want to take a wild guess?
I was thinking 14 is narrative and 15 is poetry.
That's exactly right. Yes. Yeah, good job. At least that's the way, it was formatted in the Bible before I put it on here. So what put you off to that? How did you realize 15 was a poem or poetry?
Well, the way the sentences are structured,
okay,
it's kind of like almost even lengths or same. It's more, and it's also more almost taunting. Mm-hmm. The enemies and that kind of stuff. It's not really a story in there. It's just a lot of emotion, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very good. Emotion. Yeah. Anybody else? What are some of the things that put you off towards? I'm assuming everybody came to the same conclusion that 15 was the poem. What put you off towards that probably being the poem?
I guess that Moses sang the song.
Yeah, simple as that sometimes, hey? Like the text itself says, this is a song, yeah? This is a different kind of language now. Well, something I found really interesting. In the narrative, we read there was a strong east wind that came and blew the waters apart. In the poem, in verse 8, it is the blast of God's nostrils that part the water. So which one is it? What actually happened there?
Well, and even within the same verse, it takes time to phrase it in multiple different poetic ways. Like the same event, the waters piled up, it surged like the wall, and the waters congealed, like within the same verse. So it takes its time to phrase it differently.
Mm-hmm. So what is going on here? Why is the poem saying it differently than the narrative is?
It's a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the description of God's majesty and how He works in the world. Like little parts, like I said, like you said, the blast of your nostrils, the heart, the waters congealed, blew with your breath, they sank like lead. You stretched out your right hand. God might not have a literal right hand, but that's His form of, even the arm of the Lord has been revealed as Jesus many times, and that will melt away, plant them, and stuff like that. It's very descriptive, but it's very indicative, just like Jesus spoke in parables. It's like literal, but it is figurative in the sense where it's very descriptive on how God does things in a very awesome and mysterious way that we can't even begin to understand with our minds.
Mm-hmm. So, good point about the right hand. In the narrative, whose hand is actually over the water? Moses. He doesn't appear in the poem. Like in the poem, it's God's hand over the water. So whose hand was over the water? I think one of the things I'm trying to play at here sometimes, I think it's very important to recognize a narrative versus a poem, or versus poetry. Because one of the things poetry doesn't seem to be concerned with is the details of what actually happened. Rather, it seems to me, the poetry actually tries to already interpret what happened. It's not trying to tell you what happened. It assumes you know what happened and is already interpreting it for you. So how does blast of your nostrils signify an interpretation of the events? Well, what actually happened was there was a wind and the waters blew apart. So now we're thinking, like, what actually happened there? Where did this wind come from? Like, who's in control here? Who's commanding this? Well, one way to symbolize power and authority and control is, God, when He snuffs with His nostrils, the water splits.
Well, when I think about that, I think about Revelations, when Paul makes, or whoever wrote that, John, I guess, makes a reference to whom God will destroy, the Lord will destroy with referring to the destroying Satan with the breath of His coming.
Mm-hmm. So it's a figure of speech that evokes a certain kind of emotion. So one of the things poetry is trying to do is trying to go beyond just the functional language of, okay, there was A and then there was B and then there was C. Or, you have A plus A and then that's 2A. Like that's functional language. Like it's very systematic, makes a lot of sense. Poetry tries to break that barrier and tries to evoke certain emotions and actually cause you to experience something. Like if you start thinking about somebody's nostrils breathing onto water and it opening up, like that's a picture of tremendous power, right? Like it kind of puts you back a little bit and it's like, whoa, right? Like we're not talking about a buddy here, right? Like we're talking about something or someone really, really powerful. And same with the other images, right? They convey the same kind of feeling, the same kind of impression. When this being's anger burns against you, you burn like stubble. right? Like it's, you don't want to get on the bad side of this one. And that's what the poet is trying to bring forward through the poetry. So it's more than just functional language, trying to tell you what exactly happened or, the sequence of events. It kind of puts that aside and is already interpreting that and telling you, what, God is powerful and is trying to convey that emotion, that experience. Does that make sense? So what is poetry? Well, one of the things I already, like the general sense, like it wants to spark emotion, it wants to, engage your thinking. One of the things that sets poetry apart is the density in which language is expressed. So it's usually packed with a lot of meaning. There's very few words. They don't really lavish on trying to expand on a long argument and trying to explain it all to you. Like it's short little sentences. And it's one image after the other, and they're all being combined and they all create meaning. They're all jam-packed with meaning. We'll come to that being packed with meaning a little bit more later. Another thing that sets poetry apart is use of creative language, right? We just had some examples there. We use creative language actually all the time in our daily life. I don't know if you ever noticed, we use things like, Ronald's a terribly nice guy.
Terribly.
Like, what now? Is he terrible or is he nice? But we all understand what I mean when I say terribly nice, even though, like, logically that doesn't really make sense. So that's one way of using creative language. And poetry really, really loves to do these kinds of things. Poetry uses images and metaphors. I already mentioned one. When God's anger is unleashed, when his burning anger is unleashed, it consumes the enemy like stubble. Like, the word like is always a very good indicator of an image or a metaphor, right? Like it's comparing something with something else. And so when God is angry and his anger is let go onto the enemies, they just, like stubble, as quickly as stubble catches fire and burns up, that's as quickly as the enemies vanish. So poetry uses a lot of images and metaphors. And then this is something I already talked about quite a bit here, so it invites you into an imaginative experience. So there's the nostrils was one example with that. Verse 12 was the hand. So it's already interpreting, it wasn't actually Moses' hand over the water that had the power, it was God's hand. So it's already interpreting a certain experience. If you think about it, for the Israelites, there would have been no doubt in their mind that they experienced this. They would have known that it wasn't Moses' power that split the water, right? Like it wasn't his right hand that split the power. They experienced God's power in that moment. But if you were to just read the story, like just a sequence of events, you would be like, okay, and then Moses put his hand over the water and the water split. And you might be tempted to think, oh, it was Moses who did it. But the poetry tries to bring you back into that experience that if you would have been there, you would have known it wasn't Moses' right hand that split the waters. So it tries to invite you into this imaginative experience to try and bring a sense of what it was really like to be there, or evoke certain emotions or thoughts inside of you.
Evoking emotion, yeah. I like how you put up density of expression. Because it shows the depths of something. Like you can, it takes on like such multifaceted. It's not monochromatic. It's multi-layered. And
so the last point here is a little bit of a wordy last point. This is the best way to put it succinctly in one sentence, so I can put it on a bullet point. The point basically is this: the way that poetry works is that the poet, when he sits down to write a poem, he takes on himself or herself certain constraints in order to write a poem. So an example in English would be a poem has to rhyme. So when you try and write a poem, you are taking upon yourself this constraint that the lines have to rhyme with each other. There's different kinds of poems, but one of the constraints you can take on yourself is rhyming. Another one is meter, right? Like, certain syllables, they all count. Like you can only have the same count of syllables in each line. Another example that I quite like is the Japanese haiku. Anybody know about that one? So you got the 5 words, and then 7 words, and then 5 words. That's a Japanese poem. And it's a constraint that you take upon yourself in order to write this poem. Now, you would think taking this constraint upon yourself limits you, right? Like you would think it kind of limits the poet now to express what he really wants to express. But as it turns out, that limitation actually forces the poem to create something new, something very dense, He has certain parameters he has to work within now. So he's making it count. He's making it count now. He's not going to waste any time or any space with lengthy arguments. He's going to try and find words and pictures that get to the point right away. And because of that, we go back to number 1. It has a density of expression, right? Like it's very jam-packed with meaning. Every line, every image is full of meaning, and because of that. And that's where you get poetry. Takes a lot of work. I think one of the, I don't know if it's a myth, but kind of one of the notions I had about poetry is some people just kind of sit down and they write a poem and it just kind of flows out of their thoughts. And I'm sure there's some people out there that are gifted, but one of the things that became very apparent to me preparing is that poetry is actually a lot of work. Like people that write poems, and specifically people in the Bible, the authors, put a lot of work into a little bit of text. And often we just skim read it through. We don't even give it the amount of time that it deserves because of the amount of effort that went into making this. Anyway, so that was a little side note of something that really caught me off guard, where I was like, oh, okay, like writing a poem is actually a lot of work. So what about biblical poetry? Like that was poetry in general, so a little bit more specific now, biblical poetry. We talked about these constraints. So what are the constraints that the biblical poets take upon themselves? Unfortunately for us, we didn't find a textbook yet. There's no textbook explaining to us how in the ancient Near East poems were to be written. So what we can do is, and some people have done this, they have dedicated their lives to it. They have read all the poems and they've started to deduce, okay, like it looks like this is a constraint, or it looks like they all fit into this pattern, or this is one of the things they do. And so I will show you tonight. Oh yeah, it doesn't seem to, some people argue it doesn't seem to fit any master system, but we do know that they had poetry. One of the obvious points we pointed out earlier, there's things like songs in there, right? Like the Israelites obviously knew there is narrative and then there is a song, and they knew the song was different kind of literature than the narrative beforehand there. Psalms is another example, right? Like they have specific naming, there's laments. So, this is where I was already a little bit earlier, so now we're here too. As far as we can tell right now, I will show you some of these things. Just know that people put a lot of effort into figuring this out. And we're fortunate enough to just kind of have it in a bullet point here tonight. Free verse. So free verse seems to be one of the, it's not really a constraint, but one of the ways that biblical poetry works. And free verse basically means there's not really a metrical scheme. Like there's no rhythm, there's no sense of like the amount of syllables you're allowed within a line. It's just kind of, you write whatever you want within your line. That doesn't mean you can write however long you want to write it. It actually turns out most poetic lines in Hebrew are 3 to 5 words. Like it's no more than 3 or 5 words. Now, some of you might be thinking, I'm pretty sure I've read some lines that have more than 3 or 5 words. And the thing is, the Hebrew language is actually a very compact language. To give you an example, to say vayakaheu, which is one word, would be translated in English as he picked it up. 4 words. So if there's any grammar nerds out there, the subject, the verb, and the direct object can all be combined into one word in Hebrew. And so it makes for very, very dense language. And so you can really make those 3 to 5 words count if you can combine these words. The best example that I could think of, I know in German, people do that. In German, it happens all the time. Words are being combined into one new word. So you get these really long words sometimes. So Hebrew is kind of like that. And so that's why in Hebrew it's 3 to 5 words every line, but in our English translations there's sometimes significantly more words than that in order to translate it accurately. Then we have parallelism and symmetry. So these are the 2 things that I want to spend our evening on. I think they're really core to getting a feel for biblical poetry. And I think if you can kind of get your grasp or your mind around it, I think the poems in the Bible will really, really come to life in a new way. But before we dive into parallelism, I just want to put in another pause and see if there's any comments or any questions at this point. Maybe I'm going a bit too fast. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
So the free verse point is a little unexpected.
Okay.
I guess in English you would say it would be the other way around. But prose would be free. You know, you can have a one sentence, a 1-word sentence or a 20-word sentence or whatever, right? But in poetry you would have, like, you decide on how many, like what the rhythm will be in your poem. But in Hebrew it works the other way around. Is that what I'm understanding? Or
So the restraint is the 3 to 5 words, not necessarily the best way I can put it, not necessarily a syllable count.
Okay.
So a very popular a poem that you might have heard in English, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, so are you, right? So if you think about it, roses are red, violets are blue. It's always 4, right? There's a rhythm, right? There's a rhythm to these lines. That rhythm does not exist in Hebrew poetry. It literally is just 3 to 5 words that are put together. And it's actually the parallelism and the symmetry where the art happens within that. And so we'll dive into that a little bit. But that's a really good question. It took me a little bit to wrap my head around that too.
a follow-up question. So if poetry is free verse, is there something that isn't free verse?
Like poetry, as in every culture has different ways to define poetry, and in the Hebrew, the poetry is free verse.
Okay, so but not saying that Hebrew narrative would not be free verse, for example.
No.
Okay.
No. Just that the poetic lines are free verse in the sense of they're not constrained to a certain rhythm. Yes.
So,
Cadence.
my understanding is there's a difference between poetry, between rhythm and meter. And just because it doesn't have any meter, it's free verse, it would still have a rhythm to it, like stress and unstressed syllables. So is that part of Hebrew poetry, was completely absent of that as well?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the difference there between the meter and the rhythm.
So meter, right? You have like iambic pentameter. Da, 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 da,
Yes.
da, right? And it repeats,
Mm-hmm.
but you can still have a rhythm within a poem, but it's not consistent.
Okay.
There's this like a rising stress to the line, and then the next line will have maybe a falling stress, but there's still a rhythm with which it is to be read.
Okay.
I was just wondering if
So,
there's
so the meter one is a no, like that one does not exist. The rhythm part is a maybe, right? Like there is a certain kind of rhythm to it, but in order for you to really get a sense of that, you would have to study Hebrew and read it in Hebrew. One of the things, like one of the reasons it has become free verse, like odds are in the beginning, for example, the Psalms they maybe had a meter. They maybe, because they were probably sung, right? Like there were songs that were sung. But over the thousands of years that the Bible has developed, these hymns, so to speak, developed into these poems that were being used for reflection upon God. And in that transition, the meter kind of lost out, because now they're like, well, we're not really intent on singing these anymore. Like we're more intent on reading and on reflecting on these. And so the rhythm might still be there, but like because it's kind of harder to pinpoint, but you would have to read it in Hebrew, I would think.
No, I'm just curious. Like, this could be totally irrelevant because because as far as meter is concerned, it doesn't matter to me because it's poetic. It doesn't have to be meter in it, and I play music just like Jeremy does, and we play whatever. Anyways, whatever. The point is, I'm just curious how many vowels there are in Hebrew.
I actually don't know the answer to that one. I would have to.
Because, it's just like, I just think about, like, when we sing our worship songs, I remember writing a song once with one of the songs in it is, oh, so I'm saying it's just like, how so often when people sing something, that everything's stretched out as it is. I mean, they stretch out all the vowels. They stretch out, and the only thing you can't stretch out in any language is a consonant. So, I mean, it's like, meter really doesn't matter because unless we spoke Hebrew, we would know how to stretch out to make meter out of it.
Yeah.
Didn't you say in Hebrew there are no vowels?
In the writing.
In the writing.
In the writing there's no vowels, so just phonetics.
And then the spoken Hebrew was already formed that for some time, right? And got just through vowels. So you don't even know how to speak the vowels these days, like the back in the day. So.
Exactly, yeah. We don't know exactly if we pronounce it right.
So we have no record of the vowels they used back in ancient times.
I'm not an expert on that either. I just know that the originals were written without vowels.
Yeah.
But there is like a later version, like I think around the year 1000 or so. It's called the Masoretic text, which is written in Hebrew, but it has some kind of like dots and punctuation around the letters that weren't part of the original written language. But that was their way of remembering, this has to sound like this or like this. So we have a fairly good idea, but it's not, because the language died out for hundreds of years, we don't know exactly.
No.
And if you've ever listened to Arabic music, the way they do their chants is like astronomical. You talk about like the Gregorian chant effect is just mind-boggling. And I've listened to some people. I remember hearing people like literally wailing at the Wailing Wall, and it's like I've heard very little Hebrew in my life, and I mean it was bad enough trying to learn Frisian with my former girlfriend, whatever. But it's like, and it's a very throaty language. Even Hebrew itself is a very throaty language.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those comments, and thank you for bringing up the clarification between meter and rhythm. Yes, So maybe rhythm, that's a maybe, and the meter for sure is a no. Parallelism. So now we're digging into some meat here. I pressed something. Most biblical poetry is written in pairs of lines, sometimes three. I forgot to add the sometimes three, but most of it is written in these pairs of lines, and you'll see an example in a second. Sometimes it's three. Proverbs 16:32. Being slow to anger is better than being a warrior. And one who rules their passion than one who captures the city. So this is two poetic lines, but you can see they're related. Not sure if that is obvious. Maybe I can ask you, what are these lines about? How are they related? Or how are they related?
Well, obviously, the anger and ruling the passion is the same thing.
Okay,
Being a warrior is someone who captures the city, same thing.
there you go.
The line starts are related and the line ends.
Good question.
So why say the same thing differently?
So you're
So if you picture two coins, this is the way I look at it. Picture two coins. You have one coin on the one side, being slow to anger, and on the other side, ruling your passions. Right? So the two images combine into one. Talking about self-control here. And then you have the warrior and the one that captures the city. Two sides of the same coin. So the self-control is better than the military success. Why is that? Is it better because self-control takes more strength? Is it better because self-control or lack of self-control causes irreparable damage to your reputation? You know, you can be somebody that conquers all the cities in the world, but if you can't rule your passions, you know, people are kind of just, you know, might look down on you or something. So that's what poetry does. Like, even though it seems like it's saying the same thing, once you start thinking about it, and you start combining the images, you start to see like a little bit of a deeper meaning into it. And it's something that isn't really done justice thinking about for like a couple of seconds. It is meant to be meditated upon. Something that we've talked about a lot is what is the Bible? And I think one very accurate description of the Bible is Jewish meditation literature. Because actually a lot of the Bible is written like this. The estimate is about 1/3 of the Hebrew Bible is poetry. It's written in these dense lines that you're meant to slow down. You're meant to think about what was just said and why was it said the way it was said. Because they only had 3 to 5 words. They didn't mess around. They knew why they picked them. And they knew why they repeated it. So parallelism generally has a first line, the A, that is the main clause. Can often, like if you look at the first line, being slow to anger is better than being a warrior, that can very often just stand on its own, like that's his own saying. And then you usually have a second line that either follows from that or that just repeats it. So I'm going to say it a different way, and I really like saying it this way. So line B either says the same thing differently, or it says something different in the same way. We can go back to Exodus 15. I found an example in verse 5. So if you look at verse 5 in Exodus 15 there, the deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. So it's saying the same thing, but in a different way. And then verse 6, your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. So it's saying something different, but in the same way. right? So you can either say the same thing differently or say something different in the same way.
So the while for verse 5 is saying the same thing differently, and
Yes.
then verse 6 is saying something different in the same way.
But because it's saying it in the same way, it's trying to combine them,
Yeah.
right? Like it's obvious that they're related because they both start the same way. Otherwise, you might not realize that they're a pair.
Yeah.
So one of the images that I quite like about parallelism is like looking through binoculars. So I don't know how many of you guys know telescope versus binoculars. If you look through a telescope, you can see something far away, nice up close. But if you look through binoculars, you get the stereo view. It adds depth. And parallelism really works in the same way. The second line really adds the depth to the first line. The first line says something meaningful and interesting, but it's the second line that really adds the depth to it. It's like having that second eye. And at that point, things become really, really meaningful and worth reflecting upon. Does that make sense? Any questions? Like I said, these are the building blocks, so I want to make sure we understand parallelism. There's a couple of different ways parallelism works. So I already highlighted 2 slightly different ways, and so they'll come up again. I'll have 4 different ways that have been officially, defined or, been put out. Don't feel constrained by these 4 ways. They're examples of how line A and line B can relate to each other. They are very common, they happen all the time, and so far we haven't found enough of another one to make another category, but that doesn't mean, this is an ongoing investigation, so to speak. We're learning more the more people sit down and reflect and think about these things. But for tonight, we'll look at four different ways that they relate to each other. So the first way, line A and line B relate to each other, is comparison or an analogy. So I have Psalm 33 as an example. By the word of Yahweh the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. So this is comparison. So we really have the same thing said again, but it's by comparing it, you're kind of adding depth to it. So by the word of Yahweh, the heavens were made. Heavens, like sun, moon, and stars. Okay, I can wrap my head around it. By his breath, all their host. Who are the host? Sorry?
The sun, moon, and stars?
Yes and no. They do tend to represent something in the Middle Near East. God is often called the Lord of Hosts. Who is he hosting? So maybe a little bit too controversial, but I think we're talking about spiritual beings here, right? Like to give it a mild term. They were created at some point as well, and so God creating the heavens and giving breath to their host kind of makes sense, right? Like, so you have the heavenly host. Who are the heavenly host? Does that sound familiar, that term? Choir of angels, right? Like, yes. So, first way that parallelism can work is by comparing two seemingly lines that are seemingly exactly the same, but when you think about them, you're like, oh, okay, they could mean different things, and then by combining them, they add depth. The second way is contrast. Proverbs 10 verses 11. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. So it's saying the opposite, but it's saying the same. Does that make sense? And it does that by contrasting things. I like the example of how contrast works in pictures. So for example, I picked the white background and I made sure I had black writing on it. So the contrast is high and it's very obvious and very clear what is written on the slide. You know, if I were to pick like a light yellow kind of color for my letters there, it'd be kind of hard to read and it wouldn't be as obvious. But by contrasting, by upping the contrast, you make it really obvious. And so poetry really works the same way. Again, right, like we don't have time to do justice to all the deep, meaningful things that are happening in each of these. I just kind of want to give you a feel of, you can compare things, you can contrast them. The next one, the third one, is complement. So we have an example from Psalm 133. Behold how good and how pleasant it is. Oh, how good and pleasant is what? So we need a second line to complement the first. So you have the sketches, and now we're filling it out with color. For brothers to dwell together in unity. So the first line, kind of gives you the skeleton. Second line adds the meat to the bones. And fills it out. So that's how complement works. And then the fourth way is sequence. This is where you'll see sometimes 3 lines put together. Psalm 31. As for me, I said in my alarm, I am cut off from before your eyes. However, you heard the voice of my petition when I cried to you. So there's almost like a little story going on here. So one follows after the other. It's almost like a narrative within the poem. That's another way how the lines can relate to each other. And that's all 4 of them on one slide. Any questions? Well, that should make the next exercise really easy if there's no questions. By the way, once we do the next exercise, feel free to grab some sweets and some water in the back. Like, don't feel constrained to your desk if you need to walk around or something. But we'll spend some time now going back to Exodus 15. Find some examples. I haven't found them, so I purposely did that. So if you guys don't find any, then we'll just awkwardly move on to the next thing. So. Yeah, sure, we might as well turn it into the group. Yeah.
Like, for example, in verse 9 and 10, it talks about the enemy boasting, right? Like, oh, I will conquer you all, like whatever. And then verse 10, but you blew them with your breath, and the sea covered them, they sank like lead in the mighty waters. Mm-hmm. So, like, is that more like a sequence, or could that work as a contrast? But it's like, it's 2 ideas, it's not 2 lines. Do you know about?
Yes.
That still works.
I mean, we're getting into symmetry soon. I think you're already starting to touch into that.
Oh, okay.
So that looks, zooming it out a little bit, but yes, yeah.
Okay.
It's basically compounding these items. You have a sequence of the enemy boasting, and you have a sequence of God's reaction to that, or what God does in response. But both of them together work as a contrast.
Oh, okay.
So it's not like any line in the Bible that has necessarily is just one of these. It can work in multiple ways together.
I don't know much about Hebrew, but I do know one thing here. In verse 11,
Yes.
when it says, "Who among the gods is like you?"
Yes.
I remember there was this crazy preacher, and he was trying to say that gods were related to, like, literally, like, mini gods or whatever. Some whacked out whole movement based on it. But I looked this up once in the Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, and it literally means Elohim. So, and you see that the Jews were highly, very, very disturbingly judgmental people. Anyways, so Elohim means judge. So, and you can notice when you read the Old Testament, everybody's always saying, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. And it's just like, it can't you discern what is good or what is evil. And so there was, even Paul makes a reference, why is it that none of you can judge anything in the church? You should take the least esteemed person in the church and help them judge for you, because everybody wants to be the judge. So, but I mean, in Psalms 86 it says, the gods, you say that you're gods, but you shall die like men, or whatever. So I mean, it's just saying that's a small analogy, just even on its own. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Any other examples people found? It's really helpful to share some of them, so then, as a class we can, the more examples we see, the more our brains are fine-tuned to them.
And I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I absolutely love reading Job, and I think he is one of the best poets of the whole Bible, because he takes things so simple, and I don't even believe that he had any scriptures to read. I mean, it's the only part in the whole Bible where it talks about dinosaurs or whatever it could be. And I believe he meditated and he found out everything by looking at nature and just exploring God. And that's when I'm out in nature, I can, when I think about his righteousness being more majestic than the mountains, in his ways high above the heavens, totally not to be understood. And I was watching a show on birds, and I was thinking, wow, they're just fascinating. And then Solomon saying, talking about flowers, and they're we're not even dressed remotely as nicely as they are, and stuff like that. So
Yeah, a lot of the wisdom literature is poetry. Like as you saw, a lot of my examples came from Proverbs. Actually, they use parallelism all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like, I know that there's some people here. I know that Monique speaks Portuguese. Think you speak Spanish too?
Speak Spanish, yeah.
I mean, it's like when all of a sudden people hear like Unigénito, it's like, which means you only begotten son, or whenever it is. And all of a sudden there's this parallel, it's just like you only have one kid, and your immediate parallel is, you want to reach out and grab your only child or something like that. There's that immediate affection thing, It's like, and I think that's why it was so powerful that God knew all these different key triggers to the Hebrews, Jewish people's hearts, and the things that would stand out in their mind. Because you think about how many times they set themselves into bondage, and God would send them a deliverer, and then somebody would, like Joshua or Hezekiah or whoever, would go in and rescue them from their stuff. And so I mean, it's like, and they understood what it meant to be in, have other nations rule over them and stuff like that. It's like me, alcohol and drugs, and well, not drugs that much, but still whatever. I had my fair share of stuff. So, yeah.
I think what I find helpful with parallelism is that it makes it more memorable somehow. And I think that's probably also why the Proverbs make a lot of use of that, because it's meant to be nuggets that you collect and that you have at your disposal to come up with. What would be good advice here? Well, let's check in my library of memorized Proverbs, because they're easy to memorize, much more so than a story or details in the story, say. So, and even if the translation isn't, let's say, perfect, or like the language doesn't quite do it as much justice as it perhaps could be, but still I think there's enough in English that we can see the parallels. And that, yeah, I think to me anyways, that makes it easier to remember, to recall, or something like that, right? I'll remember one phrase or the other, and then with that can reconstruct the other one. So.
For sure. And on the note of remembering, I also think one of the goals with parallelism is to create that earworm sensation of, like, once you pay attention and you see these two images being either compared or contrasted, you walk away and you're like why, right? Like, it kind of leaves you uneasy, and you're forced to kind of think about it throughout your day. And so that's one of the things that I think, when it comes to poetry, we actually need to invest quite a bit of time and quite a bit of thinking, and allow ourselves to think about it, like, why these two images? Why say it like that? Like I said, they weren't wasting their words. They only had 3 to 5. They were very, very keen on making it count. And their goal is to provoke certain thoughts or to create certain emotions within you. And within that, by doing so, they actually really start to shape and affect the way you think about things. So Proverbs, the wisdom literatures, they're really trying to shape the way you see things and the way you understand things. So I've said this before, the Bible is a book with an agenda. If you allow it, it will affect you, and it will affect the way you think. But it does take time. And you need to sit down and think about it and allow it to affect you. If there's no more questions on parallelism, we'll move into symmetry. Actually, fun fact first. Almost always when God is quoted as speaking in the Bible, he talks in parallelism. So I thought it was a very interesting fact. One example we have actually in Exodus 14. Verse 17. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. You see it? Right? So I found that a very interesting thing about the way the Bible portrays God, as always talking in these poetic lines. Few words packed with meaning, images that you're meant to think about, not just skim over. I don't know.
I need to give God the glory here, because this is a strange way to analogize this, but I was rent-evicted. I lived on White Rock Beach, and I was rent-evicted from there. Some people had some big company, and they wanted to turn six units into a complex to make an Airbnb. Well, supposedly now 2 years later, they haven't made a cent from it, and the weeds are like wheat now in front of the place. So, it might be just a small analogy, but it's just like their thoughts of making money just came crumbling down into naught.
Yeah.
Whatever. It's just a small thing.
Oh, nice.
And yesterday was the International Day for people being persecuted in the world for being Christians. So I don't take everything on TCT totally for granted, but just so you know.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, time's moving on, so I'm going to move on to symmetry. Psalm 62 is another fun way, I thought, of how it reflects on God speaking through parallelism, and it talks about 1 and 2s, and I don't know. I like that sort of stuff. One thing God has spoken, 2 things I've heard. What is the one thing God has spoken? God has spoken that power belongs to God. And the 2 things that I have heard is that covenant loyalty is yours, O Lord. So, I don't know, it's really interesting how you start seeing this all over the place, and how it really starts to mess with your mind, and you're forced to start to think about, what is he trying to say here? Let's move into symmetry. Monica already hinted at it we're going to start to zoom back a little bit, like we zoomed into the details, the specific lines, and we're going to zoom out a little bit and look at some symmetries within poems, and within that too, there are certain ways that biblical poets like to do it. So the first way to do it is forward symmetry. That looks kind of like this. Psalm 33. Yahweh frustrated the plans of the nations. He reduces to nothing the schemes of the people. The next line, Yahweh's plan endures forever, the schemes of his heart from generation to generation. So you have a line A and a line B, and those are related to each other. And you have another line A and another line B that are related to each other. But then, when you look at it from a little bit further away, you can see that both the A lines are also related. Like they also have similar things, and same with the B lines. So you get this pattern of A, B, A, B. Does that make sense? I'm kind of cruising through here. We don't have time to reflect on what the psalm is actually trying to say, but just so you can see the pattern. The next one is reverse symmetry, also known as chiasm. So Psalm 137 is an example. If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I don't remember you. So you have line A, line B, and line B and then line A. So it's kind of flipped around at the bottom. So that's chiasm. And a little side note, you might have heard the word chiasm already with Monica and during the narrative, I believe.
I didn't touch on any of the
Okay.
types of.
I think you mentioned the word chiasm though.
I think
Yeah.
at some point
Something like I think it's Exodus, right?
Yeah, Exodus.
So-
that's a huge.
So these symmetries, they actually work within the narrative as well. So, it's a similar idea, but just on a much grander scale. We'll actually get to that. So just so you know, like within biblical literature, like chiasm is a pretty famous word. So that's why it sometimes pops out with the narrative as well. And so then there's complex symmetry / reverse symmetry. I mean, I just think complex symmetry is one way of saying, and then all the others. Because once you have three lines, like in this case, love the Lord, all you his godly ones, the Lord preserves the faithful. Now you start to have quite a few combinations, and fully recompenses the proud. The Lord preserves the faithful and fully recompenses the proud. Be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who hope in the Lord. So you can see A, B, C, and then it gets a little bit complex with C, A, B. This is really easy. I put it up here, you can see it. But to figure this out, you will actually have to spend quite a bit of time on these 6 lines to notice that. I don't know if that's obvious to you or not, but just so you have an example here. But if you spend some time with these lines, you will start to see some of these patterns, some of these symmetries, and they can get quite a bit complex sometimes. And so, as I already hinted towards, that symmetry doesn't just work with a couple of lines. It can also work with full stanzas. So here's one example of Proverbs 4. So you have a whole paragraph, 2 middle paragraphs, and another paragraph, and they have that A, B, B, A pattern right now. Just the way I highlighted it and the way I marked it, I think, shows that it's that reverse symmetry, the chiasm, but it is on a bigger scale. So it doesn't just happen within the lines, but it also happens with paragraphs or stanzas, as a fancy term in poetry. And then finally, an entire psalm. An entire psalm can be structured that way once you spend the time to figure it out. And as I mentioned, the entire book of Exodus is actually also structured like that. So these patterns and these symmetries actually pop up all over the Bible. And once you train your brain to think in them or to notice them, you'll see them everywhere.
One comment in case for those for whom chiasm is new. So he marked it very nicely there. But so far we have only like A, B, C, C, B, A, B, C, C, A, B, for example, the other one. But it can have one line that it could be A, B, C, and then B, A. So it doesn't always have to be two lines together.
Mhm.
Or like two ideas. They can be like one main idea, be the central one.
Questions on symmetry? Comments? Does it make sense?
Did you say all of Exodus is
The entire
in
book, yeah.
symmetry? The entire book?
Like one chiasm or
Yeah, like just the way it develops. Somebody really smart with a lot of time and a lot of willpower figured that out. I feel like it would take me ages to figure that out, right? Like, to be honest with you. So even if I look at a psalm like this, it looks like, oh, I can see that, but you can see it because I formatted it a certain way and I highlighted it. But for somebody to actually notice, oh, that idea and this idea, they combine. And then, oh, these ideas. I mean, I'm sure once you get the ball rolling, you'll see it. But, to get there takes some practice. Talking about practice, how about we practice symmetry? And let's pull out Psalm 29 for this one, just to switch it up a little bit. I'm sure we were getting tired of Exodus 15. So look for symmetry. Feel free to find parallelisms as well, but look for symmetry right now. And I'll give you guys 5, maybe 10 minutes. And then we'll come back together. Okay. How about that?
is there one right now?
Look at some of it together, see what we come up with. Any
It just comes in here at verse 9.
any findings, ideas? I know it's a bit of a rush, but time is a bit limited. I don't want to go too much.
I like how the first two scriptures are very instructive, and the rest of them just declare the power that God has in the world.
It's a
And
very,
it's very,
very interesting instruction, eh? Give to Yahweh. Like what kind of setting would you say that kind of instruction?
worshiping and praying and paying
Where
attention.
do you worship?
Praying and paying attention.
Where do you worship?
Everywhere.
Like in the ancient times.
The temple,
There you go. That's the key word. Temple.
the Greek temple.
Yeah. Any ideas? Anybody else want to help out why I pointed that out? The temple appear again in the poem? Yeah, like you were right on track there, Scott, with the first two, right? Like they set the scene for the first temple. Where's the second temple?
Verse 9.
Yeah, verse 9. Towards the end of verse 9. So you got the two similar settings, right? Get the sandwich going.
The other thing that I found that was very profound about this whole piece of scripture here
Looks like it's
is because of a particular scripture I read. What do I have to give you, God, that you have not already given unto me? Give to Yahweh, O sons of God. He has made us the sons of God by faith in Him. Give to Yahweh glory and strength. He already has glory and strength. So it's referring to me to giving Him glory by being obedient to Him. And then giving to Yahweh the glory due to His name. We can't make His name any better, but I should pay attention in declaration of the power that He holds by His name.
Yeah.
Since in His name is above all other names. So we think about Jesus all that much more. And then worship Yahweh in the majesty of His holiness. We can't change the majesty of His holiness, but I certainly am responsible to embrace the majesty of His holiness.
For sure.
And then the
Very
rest
much
just
so.
speaks for itself, just the power God displays in the universe.
Thank you, Scott. Any other? Yes.
Yeah, there's like a really big sandwich between 1 and 11, where they're saying a different thing, but in a similar way. One is give to Yahweh, and then 11 we have Yahweh gives.
Ah, good pickup. Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they're related, but they're different, right? So parallelism. Well, it's not parallelism, but it's that contrast working there, right? You know they're related, and so you start to put them together, and you're like, oh, you have You have people giving to Yahweh strength, and then Yahweh responds by giving strength to his people. Very interesting, yeah.
And the section between verses 5 and verses 9, where it talks about like direct actions, they starts and ends speaking about like destructions of trees, both verses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's good. I haven't actually picked up on that one yet.
I think that the big pieces that I find is what has already been identified. There's the call to give to Yahweh, and then later the call to receive from Yahweh, because He gives. And then we have two sections that describe why we give, or that's my interpretation of it. This is describes the power of Yahweh. Just His voice does all these remarkable things. And then the centerpiece is verse 6. That one doesn't have a parallel. Mm-hmm. But it's a very interesting one to have in the spotlight there in the center. But anyway, that's I'm not sure if among these statements about the power or the voice of Yahweh, if there's further subdivision that would form a chiasm, but we have at least 2 blocks of those, right? 3 of each, I think. 3 on either side.
One thing I wanted to point out with symmetry, don't force the text into it because you think it has to be. You know, Christian said there is symmetry, so it has to be. The idea of symmetry is to help you understand the text, not to make it say something it doesn't. So don't feel pressure of like, oh no, like it needs to fit. If it doesn't fit, that's maybe a sign of like, okay, maybe I need to rethink this, just let it go and like start again, right? Like it is hard work. Any questions on parallelism or on symmetry? Like I think they're really important, and I think they're the building blocks for poetry. Like when you get those down, then you can really.
General question: is there much or any poetry in the New Testament, or is that kind of a Old Testament thing?
A lot of it is quoted from the Old Testament. There is some hymns that like they will quote things like, oh, you guys know this well-known hymn, and then it. They will quote a hymn, and it uses similar ways of doing it. Best example of parallelism I can think of on the spot from the Bible. Blessed are those who, because they. So it's a very, very interesting way of using parallelism as well. It's more of a one follows the other, but I think it's very much ingrained in their thinking as well. It just doesn't have. We just don't have a book like the Psalms or Proverbs where it's like an entire book full of it, right? So it's more embedded in the narrative, I would say.
And I think the metaphors that Jesus uses is very much a part of poetry because it's so descriptive. I mean, how more descriptive can you be if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like it'd be harder to put a camel through the eye of a needle. If that isn't poetry, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just like, let's fire that through there. Let's
Proverbs,
see if we
like
could
Jesus
fit $100 million
Proverbs.
man through the eye of a needle.
I know we're going a bit late. I want to dive a little bit into Psalm 29. Because I think it's a really powerful poem. I know Scott pointed it out already here, and I think it's really beautiful. So if you guys indulge me for a couple of minutes, this is a bit more of a fun. This is not so much teaching. If you guys understand parallelism, symmetry, I've done my job. This is the part that I really enjoy. First of all, I think it's really helpful for this psalm to understand the context. There's Lebanon, there's Mount Sirion, and there's Kadesh. You guys know these places, right? Ronald, kind of, maybe.
I know Lebanon, Kadesh.
So I like to picture ancient Israel with my hand here. So you have that crescent, like this is the Mediterranean Sea here, and you have Egypt down there, and you have Israel here.
Maybe if you do it in the reverse.
Is that? No, I think that should be
Yeah,
right
but
for
we're
you guys.
facing.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly.
So it's
It's
facing
easier
this
for
way.
us to picture it when you go.
So about like this, like this, right?
No,
Yeah.
Just
Or
turn around.
that way, yeah. It's because for us it's in reverse. It makes sense to you, but to us it's
So
in
like
reverse.
do what you were doing, just turn it around to us.
Let him
Like
explain.
if it would be, I guess so, yeah. I guess so on this side. Anyway, I thought about this a lot of times, all the contrasting and comparing. I'll just trust Ronald's judgment. Doesn't quite make sense to me here. Mediterranean Sea, Egypt. You have Israel on the side here, like on the coast. Up top, you have a mountain range called Lebanon. And you have that one mountain that's pretty famous, kind of like Mount Baker for us. It's called Mount Sirion, or Mount Hermon, sometimes called. So then down here, when we came from Egypt and we went to Canaan, we walked through a desert Kadesh. So we have Lebanon, we have Kadesh, we have the Mediterranean Sea. I think it's a very important context for the psalm because I think it starts to set the setting. We're looking, which way are we looking? We're looking out onto the sea. We're seeing something coming. The next thing, the word that is translated voice in here is the Hebrew word kol, which means sound, voice, or thunder. And it's used to describe Yahweh. So in other places, for example, in Exodus 20 or in Genesis 3, it's translated as the sound of God or the sound of Yahweh. It's very interesting. In Psalm 29 here and in Exodus 20, that sound of Yahweh is accompanied by clouds, by storm, by thunder. And for some reason, many translations in Genesis 3, it's translated with the cool of the day. The actual words is the wind of the day, right? Like that's how you would read it in Hebrew. And somehow we make that conclusion that wind is kind of calm and it's kind of easy, which I thought was very interesting. Like in light of Psalm 29 and in light of Exodus 20, the sound of God tends to be accompanied by a bit of a harsher wind. Back to Psalm 29. You're the Israelite. You're looking out onto the sea. You're seeing these storm clouds rolling in. You hear the thunder crashing. And what does it do? It breaks the cedars. We live in mountain ranges. We all know about cedars and mountain ranges. Those aren't small trees. Those are big trees. You can feel the power. You can see the imagery. You see Lebanon leapt like a calf. The mountain range leaps like a calf. That's how heavy the thunder is. Mount Sirion like a young wild ox. Flashes of light, fire. And it's like you can just see the Israelite looking out into the Mediterranean Sea, seeing the storm coming in, and he's reflecting on the power of Yahweh. How his whole world is being shooken because God's sound is there, right? Like very, very powerful experience, especially when you add a little bit some of this context in there. And then, you add all of these insights we had earlier about giving to God strength, and it's really God that gives strength, not us giving him strength. So I think that really, for me, encapsulates what poetry is about. It's trying to bring you into this experience where you don't just say things like, "Oh, God is powerful," but you can almost feel it by just picturing these pictures, by engulfing into these images and these metaphors. You can feel the thunder. That's it for me for tonight. Hope you guys have a good rest of the week. feel free to help yourself to some almond roca back there and some water bottles. And I'll hope to see most of you next week. I think we're back with Monica, right?
Only most or all of us?
I hope most.
At least most.
What's next week anyway?
Monica, do you remember?
Law and prophets.
Nice.
Law. Oh.
Yeah.
Laying down the law.
Yeah.